Welcome to the San Gorgonio Chapter Trail Talk series. My name is John St. Clair, and I am your Zoom host tonight. And tonight's topic is going to be very interesting. I think you're going to enjoy it. But before we get to tonight's topic, I want to tell you what next month is. Dave Melton is doing favorite winter hikes in Joshua Tree National Park. And I also want to go over some of the ground rules. So everybody should be muted except for the person talking. And if you have questions during the presentation, click on the little talking bubble icon at the bottom of your screen where it says chat, and type in your questions in the chat section. And we will monitor that for the speaker and relay questions at appropriate times for the speaker to answer. And now what I'm going to do is introduce Julianne Anderson. Julianne is a member of the Trail Talk Committee, as am I, and it'll be her job tonight to introduce our speaker. So now I remove my spotlight. There we go. Okay, Julianne.
Thanks, John. Thank you, and good evening, everyone. I'm Julianne Anderson, as John mentioned, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Brian Shomo, who's going to speak tonight about the Riverside County Habitat Conservation Agency, the RCHCA, which owns huge swaths of land or manages large swaths of land in the western part of Riverside County, and in large part helps manage the Stephens Kangaroo Rat population, the SKR. And those of us that have lived in Riverside County for a few decades are well familiar with the K-Rat, Stephens Kangaroo Rat. So it'll be fascinating to hear about the RCHCA land management and the K-Rat and other things that Brian is in charge of. So without further ado, let me introduce our guest. Brian Shomo received his Bachelor's of Science degree in terrestrial biology from the University of Pittsburgh, and we were just talking about that beautiful university, and has a Master of Science degree in population community ecology from the Indiana University of Pennsylvania. He has over 21 years of experience working in the field of natural resources management for threatened and endangered species native to Southern California. First serving as an ecologist with the Department of Defense, and then as the director of the Riverside County Habitat Conservation Agency, RCHCA. Brian is an Ecological Society of America certified ecologist and has spent much of his career coordinating diverse management interests in implementing habitat conservation plans and land management programs for threatened and endangered species conservation. His current duties for the RCHCA include being the liaison to various federal, state, and local agencies and meetings and committees, as well as leading and coordinating the agency's efforts to recover the Stephens Kangaroo Rat, while ensuring that the agency complies with all applicable federal, state, and local laws and regulations pertaining to K-Rat management. So a big job with lots of land and a very important species that we know and love here in Western Riverside County. So with that, Brian, take it away.
Thank you, Julianne. Thank you, John. Appreciate the introduction. I'm going to share my screen here in a second and come up with a presentation. Just bear with me for 1 second. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Okay.
Beautiful.
And okay. So this basic presentation is we like to call it a success story, but the story is ongoing and it will continue for a long way into the future. And at some point, even we can consider it almost in perpetuity, because the monitoring, if it is ever recovered, will continue on. And so I have the pleasure of managing the agency at this time, but I want to, when we go into the RCHCA, I just want to emphasize it's basically a relay race, and the baton has been passed down numerous times. There's numerous people that have carried that stick and carried the story of the Stephens Kangaroo Rat far and wide, and it's just built on each other's backs. And hopefully when the next person gets the baton, they keep running with it, and eventually we fully recover the species. But it is a success story. It took a huge amount of effort over the years, and this presentation will summarize those efforts. Well, I can't go. It won't move on. All right, well, let me shut this down real quick. I can't change slides right now, so just bear with me 1 second. I'm not sure why I can't. There we go. All right, so the presentation overview, we'll just take a real quick dive into the history of the RCHCA, why it was formed, what its mission is, what its mission was, and what it is currently. We'll meet the Stephens Kangaroo Rat. If some of you aren't familiar with the species, we'll dive into some of its natural history. We'll discuss some of the management methods that we use. Management is important to the recovery of the species. Some of the historical monitoring strategy, and some of the drawbacks based on that historical monitoring strategy, and why we had to have such a huge effort to turn that ship around in order to develop a range-wide management and monitoring program. And then steps towards recovery. I think I included a public access kind of slide because I know a lot of people were interested in that in the SKR reserve system. And then we'll have a question and answer. But I also want to say if I miss, because as we go through the presentation, if I miss something in the comments, by all means, feel free to comment, and then we can basically address that as we go. We don't have to necessarily wait to the end. It kind of leads the conversation. It helps me see what people are interested in as we go along. So feel free to ask any questions, related or unrelated to SKR. Sometimes we just get into side subjects, and, some thoughts enter your head. Please, by all means, share. So the history of the RCHCA. Basically, we were formed in 1991 in response to the listing of the Stephens Kangaroo Rat as federally endangered in 1988. What happened after, for those who've been around a while in Riverside County, in 1988, once the Stephens Kangaroo Rat was listed as endangered, a lot of development had come to a stop. Nobody knew where this little critter lived, so each development project had to have its own biological survey. That biological survey's results had to go to Carlsbad U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for basically a development of an HCP or a mitigation strategy for that individual development. And that slowed things down a lot. It was very contentious at the time. From what I understand, they had a lot of bad press. The kangaroo rat was infamous and not famous, or famous and maybe infamous, because it was slowing down development so much. So in 1991, the county kind of organized an effort to get the cities and the county together to form a habitat conservation plan. We call that an HCP. And so there are one county representative and 10 cities that belong to the RCHCA, the Riverside County Habitat Conservation Agency. It's a joint powers authority, meaning it's a special district. It follows a lot of the government rules, but it's really a collaboration between the cities and the counties to provide advanced mitigation for development projects. And they did that by basically developing an SKR habitat conservation plan, which allows developers to simply pay a fee. In the case in 1996, when it was adopted, it was $1,250 an acre. If you impacted an acre of land, you paid $1,250 per acre that you were impacting. Since then, it has been lowered to $500 per acre. You don't hear that very often, but it has remained at $500 per acre for over 2 decades now. So the fee has not been increased. It becomes a little bit problematic when we're trying to manage over 46,000 acres of habitat, which is what's conserved under the Stephens Kangaroo Rat Habitat Conservation Plan. But we've been very creative, I should say, in the way that we managed to maintain the fee of $500 per acre. We have now contracted ourselves out to help others with their land management strategy. We've been very successful at getting grant funding from the federal government. And so we try not to cost Riverside County's constituents any more than we have to. And so, again, the fee has remained the same for quite some time now.
Hey, Brian.
And so, Yes.
Just a couple questions before we kind of cruise on.
Okay.
What initially alerted officials that the K-Rat was in trouble back in the day?
I believe what was an initial concern was the habitat loss. And so we like to build houses and commercial projects on flat ground. It's the same ground that Stephens Kangaroo Rats inhabit. So they like flat grassland areas. And that's what we were losing most of. It was just easy to develop those areas. And so they had a fear that all those flat grassland areas would be developed. And so there was a petition to list the kangaroo rat, and ultimately it was successful.
And who pushed the idea of a habitat conservation plan in the 90s? Was the Sierra Club involved?
I don't believe so. I think it was really the county. The county was very concerned about development. And so the HCP was, you can think of a habitat conservation plan as almost a development plan. It has the word habitat conservation in it, but it's essentially a mitigation plan for development. And so it provides a clear path for developers, a certainty to, if they do this, then this is already paid for. And so you can build your 400-acre housing project by simply paying your $500 per acre, and you can move on and you can take kangaroo rats within that project. So it provided a continuity and a certainty to development projects. I don't think the HCP wasn't initiated by any kind of conservation effort. It was to maintain development. Now, I'm not sure about the 1988 listing of Stephens Kangaroo Rat. That may have been, groups like the Sierra Club or others that may have petitioned to get that species listed. And so, but the HCP was really pushed by the county, who wanted to continue the development.
I have a question from Jane Udall. Jane's asking or saying that the Coachella Valley has an HCP also. Is this, how is this different from the Western Riverside County HCP, if you know?
I do know, and we can see that probably better on the next slide. So let me answer that as we move over here. So you can see the black line is the SKR plan area, okay, the heavy black line around Western Riverside.
Right.
Within there's 8 different reserves, and we'll talk a little about each one of them here. But to answer the question, those SKR reserves are the backbone of the Western Riverside Habitat Conservation Plan. And that plan is kind of the big plan. And so when the Stephens Kangaroo Rat Habitat Conservation Plan was originally developed, it was a first of its kind. There were no other HCPs at that time. And so they only had one species covered by it. And that became problematic because the counties and the cities again could see, well, there's going to be other species listed, maybe the California gnatcatcher or the least Bell's vireo, or some other species was going to come along, and we were going to have to develop individual HCPs for each one of those species. So the Western Riverside MSHCP first was developed after the SKR HCP was adopted, and they threw everything in the kitchen sink at it. So 146 species are covered by the Western Riverside MSHCP. And so when you build an acre, say, of housing or an acre of commercial development under Western Riverside Habitat Conservation Plan, you have to put an acre aside for development, in a sense. They call it rough steps. So development should stay roughly in step with conservation. And so the true intention of the Western Riverside MSHCP is to link the SKR reserves up. They should be building corridors and linkages between most of the SKR reserves. And so they are continuing to acquire acreage to protect not only 146 species, but to also maintain some kind of linkage between the SKR reserves. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, and because of the success and the management in the Western area, did the Coachella Valley then develop its own HCP based on?
They did. And so that one came along, and then they realized, okay, well, SKR HCP was one swing of the pendulum in one way, and the Western Riverside MSHCP was a swing in the other way. So they threw way too many species. And then so the third one that came along is the Coachella Valley's MSHCP. And I believe that has 22 or 28 species in it. So a nice middle ground, kind of the Goldilocks kind of syndrome. You found one just right.
Yeah.
That one is more clear cut too. So a lot of the problems with the Western Riverside MSHCPs is there's a lot of different options and way you can conserve and way you can develop. It was very political when it was developed. Coachella Valley's a lot of that area relies on the federal contribution. There's a lot of federal land out in the desert that is already conserved. And so there's not a whole lot of local contribution. And it's very clear in how it's defined. If you have a certain amount of area, you have to basically dedicate, I forget what the number is, but a certain amount of acreage towards conservation. Where here in Western Riverside, the MSHCP and the SKRHCP politically would never have passed or never have been adopted unless there was more flexibility in the way conservation took place. And so it's not as clear cut as the Coachella Valley MSHCP. In Western Riverside, the entire Western Riverside is divided up into little cells, little squares, and each cell is a number, and each cell has a criteria in it that is designed to say what kind of conservation takes place in that specific cell. And so there's some negotiation and back and forth and stuff like that. I won't get into a whole lot of detail, but suffice to say, the Coachella Valley does have one, and they learned from the previous two, the SKRHCP and the Western Riverside HCP, and I think it was done pretty well over in that area. But again, they had a lot of federal contribution, where a lot of the land acreage that's being acquired under your SKRHCP and the MSHCP, the Western Riverside MSHCP, comes on the back of local folks, your local landowners. And so it's been kind of contentious over the years. And I have newspaper clippings on my desk that reminds me of how contentious this organization and the SKR was back in the day, because everybody felt that we were taking land from folks and stuff like that. So it's mellowed out in years since, but it started off very contentious.
I was going to ask you, why has it mellowed out? I mean, it was in the newspaper every day in the 90s.
Yes.
Why is it part of
it's the same? So I think it's mellowed out. In my opinion, it's mellowed out because we are no longer assembling the reserve system. We are no longer acquiring land. And so once you stop acquiring land, and nobody's really impacted. And so all they have to do is pay money and they move on with their development project. What really happens is, if you have, I'll give you an example. Say you inherited some land, or you bought some land and you planned on retiring in this beautiful hillside somewhere, and you're going to build your dream house and you're going to retire there. Well, you took your plans to the planning department, say within the county. The county will say, well, you're in a criteria cell. You're going to have to conserve this area for burrowing owl. You're going to have to conserve this for SKR and this and this and this. And you can place your house down here at the bottom of that hill, but we need 75% of this land for conservation value. So now you're going to pay taxes on that land, but you're never going to be allowed to use it. And you might not even be allowed to put your house where you wanted it. They can't deny you about putting your house there, but they can tell you where you put it and how much acreage you're basically going to have to conserve. And so that's very contentious. People want to use their land in the manner they want. But from a regional perspective, is it better for the region or is it better for private property rights? And so there's a whole argument there and a whole philosophical argument to take place. From a regional perspective, there's no way you can conserve all these species without acquiring or requiring private land to be conserved. And so there would be a lot of endangered species that would go unconserved if you didn't lean on those private property owners to conserve a portion of their land as habitat for T&E species. Again, out in the Coachella Valley, it's a little different because you have a lot of federal land that's contributing to the plan success. Here in Western Riverside, there's almost no federal land. So all the conservation, there's 146,000 acres that are needed under the Western Riverside Habitat Conservation Plan, on top of the 46,000 acres of SKR. And so there's going to be quite a considerable amount of private land being conserved for threatened and endangered species. And I think that's why it's so contentious.
Okay, important question here from Castle Smith. What is it about the SKR that made it so important, significant initially? Is it considered a keystone species, or is it just a poster child for conservation in this area versus development?
Well, you know, Dr. Deborah Shire from San Diego Zoo calls it a charismatic microfauna. So it's cute. The way of saying it's a cute species. But from an ecological standpoint, it is what we call an umbrella species. So it's one of your major species that kind of contribute to grassland structure and kind of dynamics. Once you have a good, strong SKR population, they can collect a lot of seeds. Some of those seeds are non-native and they eat them. Some of those seeds are flowers and native flowers, and so they can really maintain the ecosystem. It's also, from a management perspective, a keystone type species. So if we manage for SKR, we manage for a lot of other grassland species, burrowing owl, pocket mice, vernal pool type habitat, so the vernal pools don't get choked in with non-native grasses. And so there's a lot of different species that could depend on SKR and SKR management. So in that respect, it's a kind of an umbrella species or a keystone species.
Okay, great. Great. And tell us about this map, Brian.
Okay, so this map is kind of busy. The take-home message is there's 8 large SKR reserves in Western Riverside. One is outside the plan area, you'll notice, and I'll talk about that one. It's a little bit special in a way.
Do you have your pointer? Can you
Sure.
show us your pointer?
We'll start here with Lake Matthews.
Got it.
Over here in the western portion, near Corona, the city of Corona. And that's about 12,500 acres or so. A lot of this reserve, the 6,000 acres, is owned by Metropolitan Water District, and it was in place in the early 80s. It's an ecological reserve, and it covers 65 different species. They have their own MSHCP, their multi-species habitat conservation plan for Lake Matthews. The portion that's south of Cajalco Road, and so this black line through here is Cajalco Road, if you're familiar with it, that is called the Estelle Mountain portion. And it came along later. The RCHCA owns about 5,000 acres within this reserve. There's some Bureau of Land Management land, some federal land in there, and there's some state hunting grounds right up here on top of Estelle Mountain, which is the highest point in the reserve. So there's some public access allowed in this area, mostly for upland game hunting, but some other activities as well. Anything above Cajalco, north of Cajalco, there is no access. In fact, most of the land south of Cajalco, there's no access as well. But there is a small portion of hunting area allowed over here. Really, it's almost 2 separate reserves. There's a governing body that oversees the portion north of Cajalco. There's no governing body that sees individual landowners, more or less, oversee the governance of their own land south of Cajalco. So this south of Cajalco is known as Estelle Mountain. And this is Lake Matthews, and combining the reserve is called Lake Matthews Estelle Mountain Reserve. This is where some of you may have heard about the super bloom of poppies, may have even visited in 2018 or so. This is Lake Street down near Lake Elsinore. This is where the poppies were exploding in numbers, and we had hundreds of thousands of people coming out to see them. It's really well managed, I'd like to think. The RCHCA has been managing the entire property for almost 2 decades now. It's really pretty well maintained. A lot of our other reserves don't have the ability or the funding to manage it as intensely as we do here. And so the largest reserve system, or largest reserve within our system, is down here near Diamond Valley Lake, Lake Skinner. We call that the Southwest Multi-Species Reserve. It's about 15,500 acres. They have a number of species down here, including SKR, gnatcatcher. I think there's 20 some species that are covered within this area. You'll begin to notice kind of a trend. Most of our reserves are placed around drinking water reservoirs. Lake Matthews is drinking water for LA. Lake Paris is the last stop on the California State Water Project. Diamond Valley Lake is an emergency water reservoir primarily for San Diego and Point South. And it is filled by Colorado River water. Lake Matthews is also the last stop on the Colorado River. It's a reservoir from the Colorado River. And so the area right here in the middle of the area, middle of the plan area, is Lake Paris State Park. It's about 10,000 acres. That also includes the San Jacinto Wildlife Area, which is primarily used for waterfowl hunting. There is some recreational access here. This has historically been the best and most the highest amount of SKR habitat within the reserve system. For a variety of reasons, these other reserves don't have the ability to support as high a density as Lake Paris does. Unfortunately, in the past probably decade, mostly in the last 5 years or so, there's a little weed, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, but it's called stinknet, Onchocyphon proliferum. It's been taking over a large portion of the Southwest United States, but it is ground zero here at Lake Paris, and it's quite harmful, I would say. It kind of excludes every other kind of flower when it gets established. And so it was first discovered on Box Spring Mountain here in Riverside in the 1980s, and it kind of stayed that way, kind of didn't do anything much for a number of years. And for whatever reason, whether the environmental conditions because of climate change have, allowed it to prosper, but within the last 5 years, it's taken over. And you'll see it along roadways. You'll see it within people's yards. It smells like, what is that? Chamomile. It has a really intense smell of chamomile. And so this area, we're trying to actively manage it and try to put that genie back in the bottle. I don't know if we will, but it still supports a large number of SKR, but that's a very important reserve for SKR recovery. This one out here is kind of interesting. This is south of the city of Beaumont. It's about 10,000 acres. It's mostly owned by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, so state land. There's some federal land in here by the Bureau of Land Management. And I always get questions of why is it outside the plan area? Why are you mitigating projects within the plan area by purchasing or conserving land outside of the plan area? Typically, you would conserve your land where the impacts are located. This was kind of special. So back in the early 90s, March Air Force Base was going through what they call BRAC, Base Realignment and Closure. And a large portion of the March Air Force Base basically shut down, and the land was given to the cities that were located around it, the county, I think Moreno Valley, Paris, maybe Riverside as well. And they were supposed to develop it. And a portion of March Air Force Base was set aside for Stephens Kangaroo Rats. A deal was struck with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the state, and they allowed us to swap out a portion of March Air Force Base in order to conserve this area south of Beaumont. At the time, there was a big fire, I think it was the Esperanza fire, that burned through this area, and it was teeming with SKR, and there's still a high number of SKR. That trade out was litigated by the Center for Biological Diversity about 10 years ago. They found that the federal government didn't do their proper analysis. And so portion of March Air Force Base, I think around 400 and some acres, is now back within conservation for Stephens Kangaroo Rat. Although we don't have it on this map, there is a large amount of acreage within the March Air Force Base that could have been developed, now set aside for SKR conservation in perpetuity. And we still have this area out here. So a net benefit for SKR within that area. And so there's other little reserves. So you'll see this over here. This is called Steel Peak Reserve. 1,200 acres within this reserve is Bureau of Land Management. There is public access. There's some open routes for off-roading if you like to explore old gold mines. This was ground zero for Western Riverside as far as gold mining was concerned. And even during the last recession, when gold was spiking, people opened up new claims in that area and started opening up the mines again. It's kind of interesting to see people out there. We own about 200 acres in this area, and we are trying to actively open up a 1 mile loop trail within our acreage over here for public access. It's really in an underserved area of the county. There's an elementary school here that could use some, the reserve as almost like an outdoor research facility or just for recreation. And so we are attempting for the last 2 years to get permission from the regulatory agencies to put a 1 mile loop trail on existing roads and restore some habitat in this area. So if we're successful, it should be a nice little trail for the really the neighborhood within that area. There's
Brian,
some. Yep, go ahead.
what other areas might have trails or public access like that, do you think?
Man, not much. So there are some trails down here at Southwest. They have the Wildflower Trail, which is where most of the people that couldn't go out to see the poppies this year at Lake Street were being diverted over here to the Wildflower Trail. That's right. If you're familiar with the Western Science Center over there, it's just off of the Western Science Center parking lot. There's also a Gold Ridge Trail in here and some horse trails that are open seasonally. Once it starts raining, they don't allow any equestrian access, and some of those trails are shut down because Metropolitan Water District doesn't want cryptosporidium, a little parasite that gets in the water, to infiltrate their water reservoirs. So Lake Matthews, like I said, has very little hunting. Lake Paris, obviously, is a state park, has some recreation to it. City of Beaumont, the Potrero Reserve out here, CDFW, the state, had just finalized their management plan and adopted the EIR for it. And so I anticipate that this in the next few years will open up to hunting and some kind of hiking and recreational aspect. So this will be a nice chunk of land that you could go out and hike. And it's the old Lockheed Martin rocket testing facility. A lot of neat history out there, a lot of cool trails. And I think that'll be one of but most of the reserve system is closed to public access. Sycamore Canyon has some mountain biking activity. It's about 1,200 acres up here within middle of the city of Riverside. And then the last one is a real small SKR reserve. It's managed by UCR, University of California, Riverside. It's about 650 acres, and they primarily use it as a research facility. So, is there any question? Oh, any more questions on the reserve system?
I think we're set.
Okay, I'll move on. If you do, just shout it out.
Okay.
So here's our friendly little Steve. We call him King Stephen because he was the first one to allowed us to conserve so much land in Riverside. Again, he was listed as endangered in 1988, and then decades later, just 2 years ago, we finally set enough land aside and began managing enough land, and were able to demonstrate that sufficient recovery has been set aside that he wasn't in imminent threat of going extinct. And so just 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago at this point, he was downlisted by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to a threatened status, from endangered to threatened. And he's a California threatened species under the California Endangered Species Act. So now the federal government and the state are kind of aligned in their status for Stephens Kangaroo Rat. As we talked about earlier, he's important to conservation because we do consider him a keystone species. He's the foundation of the food web. Everything eats him. He also has ability to manage plants in a sense by what he forages on. And so he really is impacting the environment in much in a way we consider a keystone species. Some really interesting facts about him. Obviously, he's nocturnal, as most small rodents are. He lives in burrows. Those burrows are typically under probably 18 feet long. He has multiple entrances in those burrows, and they don't go very far underground, maybe at most 2 feet. They eat nothing but seeds. They never drink water. They get all the water they need out of those dry seeds that they forage with their front paws. Then they pack them into their cheek pouches, and they take them underground and cache them. They weigh about 2.4 ounces, or about 60 to 65 grams, and they can jump 6 feet at a pretty quick rate. And if you ever want to see something really interesting, just go on YouTube and Google Ninja Kangaroo Rat, and you'll see all their fancy moves when snakes and stuff try to eat them. They flip around, they kick, they do all sorts of acrobatic activities. So a really interesting little guy, very docile compared to a lot of kangaroo rats and a lot of small mammals who become very anxious when you trap them. You'll see in the next couple of slides, I think I have a video of it, how docile they are and how kind of relaxed and chill they are. Once we trap them, they tend to keep going in the trap. They don't get shy, and so they keep going after that food. So we'll see a little video of that later on. But that's the whole focus of the presentation, that little guy right there. So we talked about... Yep.
This is Pam Nelson. I'm just wondering, since they were downlisted, then if we're looking at a housing development or something that we're trying to, manage or make it, not so impactful, can we still use a Stephens Kangaroo Rat for an argument?
Yes. So this just because the status has gone from endangered to threatened, really in the real world, there's no difference between endangered and threatened. The threatened status allows us who are trying to conserve them to do certain things without doing a whole bunch of paperwork. So we can monitor them in an easier fashion. We can do research on them. We can manage their habitat. And so there are certain things allowed under the threatened status that we weren't, or we had to go through a whole process with Fish and Wildlife Service, a consultation before we were allowed to do it. And so this was really just a way to hopefully speed recovery along. I will say in Western Riverside, it's hard to slow down any kind of development using Stephens Kangaroo Rat at this point, because between the Western Riverside Habitat Conservation Plan and the SKR Habitat Conservation Plan, really, it's already, you pay your money and you move on. You have take coverage. You can kind of maybe steer development and maybe conserve over here, maybe not impact over here. You can, say that there's kangaroo rats on this portion of the property and maybe that should be conserved and stuff like that. But really, they can pay their money at this point and pretty much take every kangaroo rat on that property under the SKR HCP, because they have determined that enough land is set aside that the population is not going to go extinct, more or less. So any questions or need anything expanded on that?
No, keep going.
Okay, so in order to recover the species, it was imperative that we begin managing for it. And so when the HCP was first adopted in 1996, there was a whole gap. So the old ecological theory was, okay, if we conserve enough land, then nature will take care of itself. And so all we have to do is fence it off, set it aside, and things will be great. And about 10 years goes by. Now we're into like the early 2000s or so, mid 2000s. And they start realizing that kangaroo rats on conserved property are becoming less and less. Their population continues to go down. And so the RCHCA was one of the first to realize this. And we had a great executive director at the time, Carolyn Sims Luna, and she really was the RCHCA. I think she had one employee at that point. But she made the decision that if we're going to own this land, then we need to manage that land. And so she went and hired a principal planner named Gail Barton. She hired a great basically administrator, Princess Hester. She hired myself as a natural resource manager. And her whole thing was we need to manage this land in order to bring numbers up. And so that was our focus. And she allowed us the flexibility and she allowed us the creativity to come up with various ways to manage it. The species responds extremely well to management. And so one of the things we noticed right away, as you can imagine, in the mid 2000s, we were going through the recession. Money wasn't available. It was just a really tough time. So we needed to be able to manage large amounts of acreage for relatively cheap or no money. And those two are often conflicting. How do you do a large area and no money to do it? And so we had certain tools available to us. We could mow the grass, but that was labor intensive and it cost a lot of equipment to get started. And then really, how much can you mow? You might mow a couple hundred acres, if you're really sitting there for weeks on end. You could burn it, but there are certain restrictions and there's certain public perceptions about lighting large scale fires. There are air quality concerns. So AQMD, the Air Quality Management District, is very concerned when we light a fire and how much particulates are put into the air because each region has its own air quality standards that have to be met. Local folks who live around where we're putting the prescribed burn down really have to close their windows. If you have respiratory issues, you have to take certain precautions, that kind of thing. So fire is a useful tool, but we're not going to burn 5,000 acres. Just not going to happen. Herbicide was another one. Again, as conservation-minded folks, we don't like to spread a lot of chemicals. And so those were really just for targeted type operations. And so what we came up with is grazing. And Gail Barton, our principal planner at the time, her family used to own about 6,000 acres down near Lake Skinner. And her grandfather was a dry farmer, and they grazed that property down there. And so her idea was to bring back grazing in the manner that they used to do it. And then I kind of took that and ran with it and did a targeted grazing strategy where we tried to basically simulate native herbivores and how they would move across the landscape. And so we have domestic sheep now where we move them quite often. So before they would put sheep out and they would eat it down to nothing, and then they'd move them over and then eat it down to nothing. And that's not typically how native herbivores eat. If you ever watch antelope or deer, they kind of eat, move on, eat, look up, move on, because they're constantly aware of predators. And so we had to work with our grazing producer, and we brought sheep out. Between 500 and 5,000 sheep have come out to various reserves, and they move across the landscape in a manner that's basically just clipping the seed heads off the grass. They aren't grazing it down to nothing. And by clipping the seed heads off the grass, there's less seed available the following year. And so over time, it's a slower process, but over time, the density and the height of those grasses has been diminished, and which has allowed the SKR to flourish in those areas that we have grazed. Grazing is free to us as long as we can give the producer enough acreage. He gets basically free food, and we get weed abatement and SKR habitat enhancement. So we costs nothing to graze for us. And so we did 3,000 acres here at Lake Matthews last year with our grazing program. For context, we were only able to burn 300 acres and we mowed about 200 acres. And so grazing is our primary management tool we use. Unfortunately, grazing has become almost a dying industry here in Southern California. There's 1 or 2 producers left, and they are impacted by labor laws at this point. A few years ago, I think when some of you might have heard, like Uber, were they employees, were they contractors, that kind of thing. And so our producer typically we require shepherds to be out here 24/7 when the sheep are out here, and they live out here in a trailer and they've got their groceries brought in and stuff like that. But we may run into a problem where these folks aren't able to live there without paying them at night. So there's going to have to be shifts involved, or otherwise there's overtime laws. There's a whole bunch of things that went into effect a few years ago, and which is really cutting down on the amount of grazing producers at this point. So just something to be aware of. We're certainly working with our producer to hopefully maintain that. We may have to pay him at some point in the future to continue to do that. But there's population management as well. And a lot of that, hopefully we don't have to get into. If we manage correctly, and if we land manage correctly, and if there's enough land available, then hopefully we don't have to do translocations and reintroductions. We have worked with the zoo, and I'll get into this a little bit later. They have done excellent research and can come up with an excellent translocation plan. If the world falls apart and it becomes so fragmented that genetic drift occurs, so you start getting a lot of inbreeding of kangaroo rats, then we have the ability to introduce new genes to the gene pool through a translocation. And it's been demonstrated and tracked almost over a decade now. And it has shown that multiple generations can develop after a successful translocation and reintroduction. I'll get into that a little bit later. But the idea, the last one is threat management, and that's constantly evolving. It used to be non-native grasses, your brome grasses and stuff. It moved into mustards and stuff like that. And now it's this little plant here, stinknet clustered chamomile. Where we see it, it rapidly gets established. It has multiple germinations throughout 1 year. That the hurricane we had in August, it germinated enough, and it's flowering right now. We've never seen it flower this early. And it will continue to flower and set seed, continuing through the spring and maybe the summer if there's sufficient moisture. So it's really well adapted to our area, and something we are going to have to contend with in the future.
Hey, Brian.
Yep.
Can you just tell us how is the K-rat helped by grazing? Is too much grass detrimental?
Good question. So I should have touched on that. Back up. So yes, so I kind of mentioned that they get down to the ground and they sift the dirt and get the seeds out with their tiny little front paws, right? So if you have too much rain and you have a lot of vegetation growth, one, they have a difficult time moving through it. If you can imagine being their size, moving through 2 feet of grass. They really like 50% vegetation to open space by midsummer or so. And so if they can't get down to the ground because there's a lot of thatch built up or a lot of vegetation that they can't move around, then that negatively impacts them. And they could, one, not get enough food, and so they don't reproduce. So if females don't have a certain body weight, they aren't able to reproduce. And over time, if they didn't get enough food, then that's when their population declines. Or they can outright simply perish because there's so much thatch on the ground that they can't get through to the food. And so they just would either basically die off in that area, or they would more than likely, if there's any dirt roads, what I see is they fall back to the dirt roads, the only space available, and they fall back to that dirt road. And they run up and down that dirt road, and that sustains their population. And then when the grass gets managed or a wildfire or something goes through to get rid of that grass, then they expand back out again. But the idea of a successful management program is you don't want to see a huge cycle of populations. You don't want them to keep going up and down dramatically. They're small rodents, so they will naturally fluctuate in populations. But the idea for proper management program is to maintain that vegetation structure kind of at an even kill, and so their populations can rise, hit kind of a carrying capacity, and then more or less maintain themselves if you're managing properly. And we'll see that in one of the slides coming up here. And so this is just the first video here. And and kind of share a little bit of our management with you. I'm going to try optimize share sound. There we go. And I know some of you might be falling asleep right now, so a quick video.
No, love it.
Hi, my name is Harry Sandoval. I'm the Natural Resource Manager for the Riverside County Habitat Conservation Agency. And we carry out restorations here at the RCHCA for all the native species that are around here. Previously, all these lands that the Lake Matthews Reserve is on used to be agricultural lands. There used to be a lot of citrus growing in the area, lots of oranges, kiwi, and other citrus fruits. Over time, all that citrus was removed, and we've been in the process of restoring the lands for Stephens Kangaroo Rat and other species as well. We use a variety of tools to restore the land. Sometimes we use fire, we use herbicide to control weeds, and sometimes we use grazing from livestock such as sheep. When we use fire, we use controlled burns. Now, controlled burns are fires that we have a lot of control over. We make sure that they're safe for people and all the environment around us. We actually have firefighters out here lighting the fires and making sure it doesn't get out of control.
Fire does create a lot of air pollution, and so we're limited on the amount of area that we can perform a prescribed burn on, usually around 250 acres or so. Grazing is what we prefer. We can do it over a large area. It doesn't impact air quality, and it's very sensitive to the environment. And finally, we have mowing. We don't mow how your parents or your gardeners or whoever mows your own lawn. We mow in a different fashion. We come out several times a year, about monthly starting in January, and we mow just the very top of the grass in order to clip the seed head so that seed doesn't fall down on the ground and resprout next year. And we do it in a fashion where we keep it much, much higher. And that way the Stephens Kangaroo Rat can go through these grasses, and each year there's less and less grass available to hinder their movements throughout their habitat.
Once we have a clear landscape, then we go ahead and replant. And we usually put out a lot of seed and make sure that it comes up over the next few years. So after we plant everything, we make sure that all the plants that should be there are there, and all the ones that aren't are gone. Then we monitor and make sure that all our species that should be there are there as well. We do that forever, making sure that everything stays in balance.
And that's it. And we'll see some of the fruits of our labor. So these are all gold fields. This is a vernal pool just south of Cajalco Road here at Lake Matthews. What you should take home message here is the grass is right there in the middle of the screen right here, are brome grasses and barleys and stuff like that. What you don't see is a whole lot of that. And this was grazed quite a bit. There are fairy shrimp within this vernal pool here. So it's the only one we have here at Lake Matthews. And so we try to take special care of it.
Brian,
Just some others. Go ahead.
I have a question to relay. Will native grazers like mule deer eat invasive grasses?
Yes. Unfortunately, we don't have that many. Here at Lake Matthews, we have some mule deer south of Cajalco Road in the canyons of south of Dawson Road, actually, towards Lake Street. And there's not a whole lot of water within those canyons. And so we don't have a huge mule deer population. And so they would naturally, if we could get enough of them, or antelope, if we could reintroduce them. That has been kicked around over the years, reintroducing antelope to our area. But so far, transportation officials have kind of put a squash on that because they tend to jump 6 feet chain link fences and stuff. So, but yeah, mule deer certainly could if we could get enough of them. Like I said, we bring out 500 in a dry year, 5,000 in a really wet year of sheep. But yeah, if we could have a number of herds of native ungulates, would be even better.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. And just some other areas. This is all taken south of Cajalco Road, north of the El Sobrante landfill. Just some of the pictures from management. And again, take-home messages. When you introduce a good grazing program and stuff like that, a lot of folks were always scared that it was going to graze everything down. And again, if the way they used to do it and the way they used to measure it is to put 100 sheep in an acre and keep them there for 3 days, that's not necessarily grazing, that's trampling. A grazer would never do that. And so grazing got a bad reputation. But again, grazing them, giving them enough acreage that they can move it, and that's key. You have to have hundreds, if not 1,000 or so acres to move them around sufficiently. So they have enough food to sustain the sheep, because the producers get paid by the pound, right, when they take them to slaughter. And so they have to have enough food for them to be there long enough, and transportation costs are what really, impacts the producers. And so we typically bring the sheep out in February, and we'll graze April, May-ish throughout our area. And just, again, clipping those seed heads, keep moving them on. Once the flowers start forming, we pull the sheep to a new area, continue to graze. So it's kind of a constant rotation, and let those flowers go to seed. And, over the years, I think it's been really successful. This, again, is just south of Cahalco Road here at Lake Matthews. And most folks don't ever get to see this, again, because there's no public access to this area. And all those tidy tips, and that's El Sobrante landfill just right up here. It's one of the largest private landfills in the country, and they have probably, I think it's about 1,000 acres in conservation that's not part of the reserve, and it's covered under their own habitat conservation plan. And eventually this will all be capped, reseeded with River City and sage scrub, and turned over to the state for conservation. And so good folks over there doing a lot. Every ton of out-of-county waste contributes a certain amount of money towards open space management in Riverside County. It used to be $1.50. I don't know if that's been updated or not, but for every ton of out-of-county waste, some money goes to Riverside County for open space management. And then, so just quickly, because I know we're probably running out of time, but historical monitoring really wasn't suitable for determining how the population of kangaroo rats was throughout their range. It was really just small scale. You need special permits to do this, so a lot of reserve managers didn't have those. I started doing it for other reserves because I had the permits, and so it was just really some permanent grids set up within each reserve. I'd go there and monitor it and basically tell them, was your management doing okay? If not, here's what maybe you could do. And we would track the populations on a reserve by reserve basis, but you didn't have enough sample size to conduct a defensible, statistically relevant study to predict the population. That's the take-home message there. It really was just small scale to tell the reserve managers if they were managing correctly. For instance, at Lake Matthews here, these were my 5 grids, and there was 5 other ones on Metropolitan Water District land, but this is the 5 grids on RCHCA property. You can see when we first started doing it in the mid-2000s, again, there was that decade lapse. I had 3 SKR on 10 grids at that point. And by 2015, we had a grazing program established. We had the prescribed burns, that kind of thing. So you've seen the numbers went up to 55 on 5 grids. Then in 2017, 62. In 2021, 91. And that's probably about the peak. It's not going to get much higher than there. We haven't repeated it yet because we've been focused on the range-wide monitoring program, but I suspect that's probably, based on our soil structure and stuff like that, it's probably about as good as it's going to get, which is really high, and just demonstrates some good management. Here's some management video. I'll play for you.
Managing and monitoring of the Stephens Kangaroo Rat is a complex process that RCHCA staff carries out in different stages throughout the year. During the spring and fall of each year, countless hours go into land management activities. SKR have very specific habitat requirements that requires lots of effort on our part to achieve. RCHCA staff use a combination of grazing, mowing, prescribed burning, and herbicide treatments to achieve ideal conditions for SKR. Once the summer comes around, management activities are usually done and the focus changes to monitoring activities. Natural Resources Manager, Harry Sandoval, is processing a captured SKR during a June monitoring session at the Lake Matthews, Estelle Mountain Reserve. He weighs the K-rat before removing it from the bag. Monitoring helps gauge SKR population density and health within a given reserve. Examining SKR populations by monitoring is a component of the adaptive management method that helps land managers determine the effectiveness of habitat management activities. Reserves are monitored on a rotating basis, with each reserve being monitored approximately every 3 years. When monitoring SKR, special attention is made to ensure the survey is conducted during the highest probability of detecting these rare animals by accounting for the lunar cycle, nighttime low temperatures, and geographic features, among other variables. RCHCA permitted biologists measure captured SKR for weight, ear length, sex, age class, and reproductive status. Next, Harry is ventrally marking the SKR with a permanent marker, so biologists can identify whether it's a new capture or recapture on later trap checks. Traps are set at dusk and then left open for 4 hours, checked, rebaited, and left open for another 4 hours before a final trap check and closure around dawn. Now he's checking for the species' sex and reproductive status. Adult animals were the majority of captures during this survey. Finally, Harry measures its ear before releasing it. A total of 92 unique SKR were captured during this survey at the Lake Matthews, Estelle Mountain Reserve, an increase of 38% since the area was last monitored in 2017. During the monitoring session carried out in June, a record number of SKR were found within areas managed by RCHCA at the Lake Matthews, Estelle Mountain Reserve. The record high number of SKR found are an indicator of a healthy population and are also a testament to the positive management activities carried out within the reserve.
And which brings us from the localized monitoring to what is the difference between a range-wide program. And so the big deal about the range-wide program is that we had to standardize the monitoring across the range. So if you can think back to 1988, when each project was being developed individually, or everybody had their own HCP, things were kind of disjointed. And so some folks were required to monitor burrow counts. Some people were required to manage certain habitats or count live counts of kangaroo rats. And so everybody was counting in different ways. And when you tried to accurately present a picture of what was happening across the range, the status and trends of the species, there was no way to basically combine those monitoring efforts into one clear picture. So this effort was really to have everybody pull their own weight, but ultimately pull in the same direction so we can get a good count. And so a lot of work went involved, a lot of collaboration, a lot of folks contributed their time, their knowledge, free of charge. It was an incredible effort, and a lot of credit goes to like Steve Montgomery, James Gannon at the Bureau of Land Management, Deborah Shire at the San Diego Zoo, Wayne Spencer at the Center Biological Institute, Conservation Biological Institute, I'm sorry. And those folks contributed a vast amount of knowledge and time, and we came up with a range-wide plan that basically looks like this. We created a habitat suitability model. And that model, if you think about when you go out and monitor across a region as large as Western Riverside and Northern San Diego, you really have to kind of focus your efforts. Where are the highly suitable areas for Stephens Kangaroo Rats? So a lot of time went into kind of making this model accurate, ground truthing it, and then going back and tweaking it. And so once we had that habitat suitability model, it could tell us where they should be. Then we had to randomly select sample sites. We went out and selected all the data. That data was then aggregated, analyzed, and then it updated the habitat suitability model. And so over time, this cycle will continue with each round of monitoring and should get more and more and more accurate and give us a greater and greater view of the population status over time. And so we're in year 2 right now of this range-wide program, 22 and 23. This is essentially what gets spits out from the habitat suitability model. If you'll notice, there's 5 biogeographical regions. Those are primarily based on topography, geography. You'll see coastal San Diego, Camp Pendleton primarily. This is what we call the Paris Plain up here. We have out here near Banning, the Potrero area, Awanga, Anza area, and then inland San Diego down here. And those primarily include a lot of the military bases, Fallbrook, Warner Springs Detachment, Lake Henshaw, Ramona Grasslands, that kind of thing in northern San Diego. And so the idea was to understand and track the spatial information. So where are SKR located, the distribution, the occupancy, the habitat value, is it good, is it bad, fragmentation and connectivity, environmental conditions, all to support conservation planning and implementation of this plan. And so once we figured all that out, we really had to go out there and collect the animals. And so we worked with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to get a lot of folks permitted. We went out there, and for the first time, we had some results in 2022. In the winter of 2022, we had a lot of rain, if you recall, and we had a lot of vegetation growth. And so the numbers, let me back up to this, but the numbers look like this. And so each year we try to do the same amount of grids, and a lot of those grids are repeats. And so we kind of can see what the grids are doing over time by resampling about 50 of them. So 48 this year we resampled. And so the numbers look like this. So about 52% of the areas we surveyed were occupied by SKR in 2022. That declined to 34% in 2023 because of all the precipitation and the rain and the vegetation growth. The average number of SKR captured per sampling cell went from 3.8 to 3.0. So those are both statistically significant drops between years. We understand there's going to be year-to-year variation, and so we know small mammal populations are cyclical. The question is that, and we will hopefully analyze this over time, is that trend continue, and is that substantial? It's statistically significant, but is that a natural fluctuation, or is that a significant drop? I suspect it's a natural fluctuation. However, we'll see this year if we continue to get rain or if we continue to stay dry, that we can compare it to either one of those years and see where the population goes. But right now, we just have 2 points on a graph. 2 points are a straight line. It's not really a trend. We suspect the line will be a zigzag, go up and down, but hopefully that trend stays stable or continues to go up. So backing up here, just want to quickly mention all the work that the zoo has done, and it feeds into this whole monitoring program. At one point, we attached backpack transmitters to kangaroo rats to watch where they disperse. The zoo folks have done an excellent translocation project and designed a way that we move entire colonies of kangaroo rats. Because before, when we'd move them, we'd simply gather them up from a development project that may have impacted them, and would put them out into a field that was conserved for Stephens Kangaroo Rat, and then would monitor that. And invariably, most of those would disappear or die or something. And then Dr. Shire came up with the nearest neighbor idea that if you collected all of them and moved them together, it's like if your kids moved across the country with you and they had to go to a new school, it would be very intimidating meeting all new people, and it may be very scary for them. Well, it's kind of similar with the kangaroo rat, we found out. If you take all their friends with them and take their entire neighborhood and plop them down in a new field and give them artificial burrows to get established in and stuff like that, they settle down right away. They took stress hormone tests, and they have very little stress. They started reproducing right away, and the population grew quite fast, actually. So it was a neat concept, never done before. And a lot of credit goes to Deborah Shire and Dr. Shire at the zoo. And so that feeds into this monitoring program as well. And so I'm thinking I'm running over time here. So I want to be quick, but I want to share it with you because it's kind of exciting. This is a huge step for us to do this monitoring program. And so again, here's the kind of the numbers in a graph kind of format. Again, you can see the big circles are the number of captured kangaroo rats and kind of the suitable habitat. And the bigger the circle, the more kangaroo rats were captured. And so you can see there's more big circles in 2022 than there were in 2023, kind of the takeaway, the visual message. And then, so what is full recovery? I kind of mentioned this. It's going to look like a zigzag line. It's not going to be a straight plan where it just goes up and up and up. It's going to have year-to-year variation. We're going to learn from our mistakes. We're going to tweak our monitoring program over time, and we will learn. It's an adaptive management plan. And so we will learn as we go, and hopefully at some point in the future, we'll have collected enough information that we can make an assessment or allow U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to make an assessment on whether this species has recovered or not. But it's taken a huge amount of collaboration with landowners, And I can't commend a lot of folks enough to open their door and open their knowledge base to help us out with very little prodding. And they've been very generous. And so that brings us to the final slide. And I know I touched on this before, but a lot of folks always ask, what's the public access or the volunteer opportunities? And RCHCA and most of the reserve system currently have a no access policy, no trespassing. We are working on that, and others are working on it as well. Like I said, CDFW out near Potrero, we're working on it at Steel Peak, that kind of thing. But currently, Steel Peak Reserve is the main federal land. They have a lot of open routes, a lot of hiking trails. Sycamore Canyon is another one. If you like hiking or mountain biking, certainly is open to all those activities. Volunteering primarily involves Earth Day events, whether that's planting a stream bed restoration project or doing some kind of cleanup of a illegal dumping. We also are always looking for citizen science folks to help us. We have a lot of game cameras out there that we have to travel to and collect those cards and analyze the endless amount of pictures and video taken on those cards. And then there's always research projects. UCR is very active in our reserve system. They just approached us again yesterday, as a matter of fact. They received some federal funding, and they're hoping to do basically track management efforts over time and how effective they are. So there's a lot of research projects going on within the reserve system. But I'm over time, and so I will entertain any questions and be here as long as you guys like, but I don't want to keep you all night.
I have a question from Pamela Nelson. Is the Riverside County Habitat Conservation Agency still acquiring land for SKR? And are the RCHCA lands considered acreage for the MSHCP needed aggregate?
Yes, on both of those. No, I'm sorry. No on the first one. Yes on the second one. So no, we are no longer acquiring land. We reached our acquisition target, and we have achieved 15,000 acres of occupied habitat within our 46,000 acre reserve system. And so no, we aren't acquiring land. As far as the RCHCA properties, yes, the SKR reserves are the backbone of the MSHCP. So the RCA, who manages, I use a lot of acronyms, Regional Conservation Authority, who oversees the implementation of the Western Riverside MSHCP, are continuing to acquire property in order to add on to the SKR reserve lands and also create those linkages between reserves.
Yep.
We had another question, Brian.
Mhm.
Any plans for widespread removal of the stinkmat plant?
Man, I wish. So we have done a lot to try to coordinate that effort. We have developed basically an app on the phone that you could enter in locations of that. We've tried to get that out to various groups, nurseries, to post signs. We have met with most of the public works departments within each of our member jurisdictions, the cities and the county. Utilities, we've talked to them about it. We've tried to coordinate it. Unfortunately, there is no large-scale coordination of it at this point. It's very expensive to spray herbicide, and that seems to be the only thing that can kill this plant. The sheep and grazing animals don't eat it. It stinks too much, and it's very resiny. Burning, it doesn't burn very well because there's not a lot of biomass to it. It's a lot of shoots and sticks type thing. And so fire burns real quickly right through it, and it doesn't consume the seed heads. You can mow it, but it's like dandelions. If you ever have dandelions in your yard and you mow them enough times, they start flowering an inch off the ground. It's very, what we call plastic. It can be very flexible. And so if you mow stinknet enough, it starts flowering lower and lower. Before you know it, your blades can't touch it. And so mowing is not very practical. So the only thing is practical is herbicide. And really, nobody has the funding or the ability to mow it. What we were hoping is, though, that we work with our public works committees and our utilities when they grade their roads, grade the shoulders of the roads or the roads that they have easements through most conserved land. Say, for instance, Lake Matthews here, Southern California Edison has a huge utility line that goes across the Stone Mountain and down into Lake Elsinore. If there would be stinknet along that road, they grade it. They just push that stinknet the whole way down and it spreads. Same thing along our highways, our surface roads, that kind of thing. And so there is some effort going on there, and they have altered their grading strategy, at least somewhat. It's hard to turn that battleship around now. They have done it all, and I hate to say it, it's always with government. It's always been this way. And so to turn that and kind of alter their strategy has been very difficult. So no, long story short, no, there's no real effort except within the reserve system. And that we're just trying to manage it and keep it at a low level. So far, it hasn't escaped Lake Paris much in the way of in other SKR reserves. We do have it in all of our SKR reserves, but the managers are really good and they've been able to keep it at a decent level.
Okay, a couple questions from Pamela Nelson. What is the other rodent, a pocket mouse, that is endangered?
There's Los Angeles pocket mouse.
Okay, and does it have a similar program to SKR?
It's covered under the Western Riverside Multi-Species Habitat Conservation Plan. And so there are objectives, species objectives for it, and it's managed, again, because Stephens Kangaroo, it lives similar places to Stephens Kangaroo Rat. So it's managed, its habitat is managed along with the Stephens Kangaroo Rat.
And is Steel Peak still open to target shooting?
It is. However, the Bureau of Land Management has increased their ranger patrols, and they have put post and cable fencing along all the major routes. So the problem before was it was like Wild West out there. There was no defined areas to target shoot. There was no patrol, and it was chaotic. And so they really have been successful at citing people for improperly being out there. And they have, again, put post and cable fencing along the major route, so you would have a difficult time straying off it. And so if you go out there now, it's actually decent. Where before you'd have to wear a flak jacket. But yeah, it's not bad now.
Brian, a couple of questions about service opportunities. I and a couple of other Sierra Club folk joined your group on Earth Day. April in the Lake Matthews area, and boy, you know, what was it, 2 roll-offs that we filled with basically construction debris, illegal contractor debris, you know, toilets, sinks, drywall, carpet, clothing, all kinds of stuff. Are you going to be doing that again in 2024? And are there any other service opportunities that we can help out with as Sierra Club members?
We would be interested in having your ideas. We do cleanups all the time. I'd love to do a restoration. We've done restorations in the past where we buy some trees and we plant one of our riparian areas. Here at Lake Matthews, all of our riparian areas were impacted when the citrus industry, Royal Citrus Company owned thousands of acres within the Lake Matthews area. And they have basically impacted a lot of the repairing the hydrology. They put drains and pipe drains in most of the drainages, which then take all the water, pipe it underground, and when it basically runs off a mile down the road. So we've been slowly restoring it. And I think that's what we're going to do for Earth Day this year. We're going to look for volunteers to come out and help us plant some trees and shrubs that would typically be in these riparian areas. And so, but there's always opportunities for more cleanups and other things. So if you guys want to do something, we don't have to always necessarily do it at Earth Day either. We'd like to do as much as we can.
Yeah, let us know, because we have our monthly newsletter that's
okay.
It's the Palm and Pine. We have a couple of print versions a year, and then the rest is electronic. But it's a good newsletter.
Okay, perfect.
Let us know in advance so that people can take part and can calendar it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because it was a great. You guys, I'll tell all those present here. You guys put on a really good work day. I mean, totally organized. Great. You know, you had food, beverages, you had gloves. The roll-offs were there. Good instruction on how to work it out, and we got a lot done.
We did.
It was fun to be out there and work with a bunch of people and just kind of clean things up. Because that whole area, I mean, I live in the area and right off of La Sierra. It's becoming a major dumping ground, and that's a whole issue. But it was nice to get out there with, you know, put on some gloves and get a crew of about 30 people and just clean it up, at least for temporarily. So
Well, thank you. I appreciate the nice words. We do try to treat you well if you're going to come out and volunteer for us.
Sure.
We try
it
to
was
feed
good.
you good and treat you well. So it's the least we can do. But that area is the tin mine area is that's a challenge over there.
Yeah.
And it could need cleaned up a moment after you fill those dumpsters. The next week you could be cleaning it up again. So we can always do more.
Well, thank you for a wonderful program. That's great.
Yeah. Just
Well, thank you guys.
just fascinating. And helped our understanding of the area.
I'm going to